YouTube, what is good? It's your man Ribs from Doing Film Things. So I finally got around to doing the test that I've been thinking about for a very long time, which is developing Cinestill 800T film in both the C41 kit and the ECN2 kit. Cinestill now sells both, and I'm not going to give you the acronyms because I kind of mess them up, and there's a lot of acronyms, but ultimately one kit is specifically designed for processing C41 film. You know, that's kind of all the basic film that you're used to shooting for color. And then the new process is the ECN2 process, which is the motion picture process that's used by Hollywood studios when they shoot Kodak Vision 3 film, for example. So of course, as we all know, Cinestill film is Vision 3 product in its origin, but Cinestill uses their proprietary method of removing the remjet, and that gives you kind of two benefits. One is you can process this film now in any lab, and don't worry that the remjet is going to ruin a lab's machines and other people's film and that kind of thing. And then two, you get this added boost of contrast potentially depending on kind of how you shoot the image and how you expose it. So I'm here to test out the two and see exactly how they play out. Just so you know, for this test, I tried to keep things very kind of strict, but I'm not a perfectionist by any means and definitely not a scientist. So there's probably gonna be a couple holes in here that you might wanna pick into, but that's all right. The point is I tried my best here. And just so you know how I did this, I basically posted up here in London at night with my tripod, and I took a bunch of bracketed images on the same exact camera on the same exact strip of film. And I basically took 3 exposures bracketed and then shot a bunch of blanks intentionally, and then took another 3 exposures bracketed. And the blanks in the middle are supposed to make it easy for me in the dark to then pull out the film and kind of cut it in that middle spot in between the 2 sets of bracketed images. And then I could develop one in C41 chems and then develop the other in ECN2 chems. All right, here we go. So what you see here is basically 6 images, and these are the 6 images that I was telling you about. The ones at the top are all developed one way, and the ones on the bottom are all developed another way. I'm not going to reveal it just yet. I'm curious what you see here as the main differences between these 2 sets of images. For one, there's one clear thing that jumps out at me right away, and that is that the images at the top all have a bit more warmth to them, and they also have a bit more hint of like the color green. It really gives you this interesting kind of very balanced exposure across the entire image. If you look at the images on the bottom, you see that there's a bigger distinction between the building on the right and the building on the left. And this image is a bit cooler. It's a bit more blue per se. The building on the right looks significantly more white than it does in the 3 images at the top. And I'm assuming this partially has to do with the developing process. Remember, I exposed these films the exact same way, same settings. Everything was basically kept exactly the same, except for the fact that one was developed in C41 and the other was developed in ECN2. So right off the bat, as we said, you see that difference in kind of color temperature. The second difference that I want to point out is potential difference in contrast. The images on the bottom, I think, have a bit more kind of contrast in the midtones. The contrast isn't overly obvious. It's not like extremely punchy. And I think that's because this image was very well lit. Like, this is a very balanced scene. But there's definitely a difference in kind of the images at the bottom and the images at the top. So I'm curious, do you see any major difference here? What do you think? Which one's which? Is the top one developed in C41 or is the top one developed in ECN2? All right, well, now that you've made your guess and you've thought about it, I'm gonna reveal to you what exactly is the case. So the ones at the top are actually all developed in ECN2, whereas the ones on the bottom are all developed in C41. And honestly, the differences are not as dramatic as many would think they might be. If you look at all of Cinestill's information online, especially on that Emulsive article, you'll see that a lot of their examples do showcase some differences, but it's not this like night and day situation. But there are some particular things we should talk about. So first and foremost is that the negatives themselves, when you develop them and pull them out and dry them, you'll see a very distinct difference between the two. The negatives developed in ECN2 are significantly thinner, and they have a bit of a different color as well. Whereas the negatives developed in C41 are much more dense. And by dense, that kind of means darker in color, but also just the exposure itself on the negative, it seems like the colors, but like the inverted colors are a bit stronger, a bit more meaty. They just look very different right off the bat, just when you look at the negatives themselves. And then when you scan these negatives, that's where you see the differences that I saw. Ultimately, I don't think any image is significantly better or worse than the other, but they definitely give you kind of 2 different products. And in my experience in the past in shooting 500T, the raw version, I've noticed that I can really scan those with kind of a flatter look, more of a low contrast, more of a log style scan, and I can really mess with them as much as I want. You can obviously do that to the C41 negatives as well, but I really enjoyed my experience with the flatter look. So ultimately, there isn't this dramatic key thing that's going to point you in either direction. It's more about the specific details, and that is where you then have to decide which one is right for you. One of the key things that makes people, or at least one of the key things that makes the motion picture studios use this ECN2 process versus a classic C41 is that ECN2 was designed specifically for motion picture. And motion picture film, they scan a lot of negatives, and they need a very consistent look across the negatives. And they also need to be kind of set up in a very kind of steady, kind of flat way for then color grading later on. Additionally, a lot of these films are actually duplicated or printed, as they say, onto other film itself, which gives you positive images, and that's kind of how they can cut the images in post. That's how they can make lots of copies. The point is, it was designed for that very repetitive process of printing and duplicating your images, whereas C41 is more of a consumer style product. You can read more about that process in that article that I mentioned. I'll put the link down below, but that's written by the folks over at Cinestill themselves, and they describe kind of the history and the information behind that. The last thing I want to talk about is actual printing at home. So as you know, I do a lot of C41 printing with RA4 chemicals, and I want to show you the results that I got here. And I'm curious, by looking at these two images, do you think you can tell the difference between which one is the ECN2 negative versus the C41 negative? And I know this isn't like, very scientific, but there definitely is a clear difference here. And just to kind of give you some details, for both of these images, I use the exact same settings on my enlarger. So the color settings are the exact same. The amount of filtration is the exact same. And interestingly enough, this one right here, which is the ECN2 negative, this printed in about 3.5 seconds or so, meaning the exposure time from the enlarger onto this piece of paper was 3.5 seconds. This one right here is the C41 negative, and the exposure time for this was about 14 seconds to achieve that exposure. So it's a dramatic difference that you see here. And this is testament to the fact that the negatives are very, very different. As I mentioned, the negative for this is much thinner, therefore light passes through it much more easily, which means you need significantly less time to expose a sheet of paper. Whereas for this one, the negative is a bit more dense and kind of a different color, and therefore the light reacts differently through it, and then of course reacts differently in terms of time as to how it hits this paper and creates an exposure. So very interesting process in the darkroom. As you see, the colors are wildly different, and again, I think that probably has to do with the different negatives. Again, I use the same exact enlarger setting, so my assumption was that these would be a bit closer in color, but as you see here, they're very, very different. And neither is better or worse. I didn't particularly pay attention to colors in this one because I wasn't trying to create a beautiful final print. I was more interested in seeing under consistent settings how each would react. So as you see here, very, very different results. And if you look at the actual prints much more closely, you'll notice that this one, the C41 one, does have that additional contrast and is evident here in this area in the white part of the building. So, you kind of get very different end results. And I think to truly see the value of the different processes, you do have to actually do this entire process, because most of us, all we do is scan, and of course that matters because that's how we share our images and that's how we get it out to the world. But these films in their origin are designed for very specific end-to-end processes that involve printing and scanning and a whole bunch of stuff. So that's where you really start to see the difference. So at the end of the day, I'm not really sure if there's any good reason or better reason to choose one versus the other. For me, what I'm gonna do is just kind of follow the instructions for the specific product. So 500T, when I buy the raw Vision 3 stuff, I'll continue to develop that on ECN2, just because that's kind of the intended way, of course. And then the Cinestill product, which is, of course, the base of it is also Vision 3 film. Even though you could do ECN2 there, I'm gonna follow the instructions that are the original kind of intention, which is to process in C41. And it's just a very different kind of look at the end of the day. And for printing, I do know that I prefer the C41 version of the negative because it does give you that added boost in contrast, and it really saturates colors just a hint more. And I just love how it looks. And when I get an image that I really, really like on the Cinestill film, and then I print it, and this is again Cinestill and C41 developing, I just think it comes out amazingly. Sometimes I think my images come out a bit flat when I do other film stocks, and I wonder how I can manipulate that. And with RA4 printing, you can't really manipulate that other than choosing different paper. Well, of course, what you could do also is manipulate the negative when you're developing it, thinking ahead as to what you want it to look like in printing. This is where film gets crazy because there's so many different variables that you can tweak along the way. There is no right answer to any of this. It is all subjective at the end of the day, but it's also all choice. And whether you're the one scanning your film or the lab is doing it, or you're the one developing or the lab is doing it, all of those things will be variables that play into your final image. So I encourage you to kind of get your hands dirty and figure out what you like the most, but just know that there is no right answer here. All right, y'all, what'd you think about this video? You enjoy it? If you did, please go ahead and leave me a like. And of course, if you haven't subscribed yet, please go ahead and subscribe. Until the next video, y'all, peace.